Hello, welcome back to Dice Goblin. Today we're going to be talking about the homebrew rules that I've put for DAGGERHEART over the last since the game started. Actually, this is going to be my 60th game in about a couple of hours from now. So, just going to give my thoughts on the various different things that I've done and changes that I've made to make the game work better for me and my groups. Let's start off with spending hope after the rolls are made. I get it that the mechanics are intended for rolls to be, everything will be calculated before and then they would roll for it. But if you don't know what the outcome is going to be, you're less likely to invest your resources into potentially succeeding for the roll. Unless you have an overabundance of resources, like let's just say I have like 4 hope. I'm happy to spend a hope to help a friend. But if I'm sitting at 1 or 2 hope, I'm less likely to help that friend. And I get that's part of the sort of choices that you make or whatever. But the intensity comes in when a player really needs that success. And you're sitting there looking at your 1 hope and you say, fine, I'm going to spend my hope to help you out. And then you roll. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But if it works, then everybody celebrates because it's like this really cool moment. So basically you spend hope after the roll is made. Meaning that, yes, you can actually meta game a little bit, causing the players to play the numbers. But I feel like that's just like if you're going to fight anybody, when you first fight them, you don't know what's going on. But then all of a sudden you start learning their tells and figuring out exactly how they move, etc. I get it. This is like reserved to like expert martial artists, but technically speaking, all the characters are experts at what they do and experts at fighting. So for them to slowly learn the challenge of the creature creates a very unique meta game knowledge that applies so beautifully with a mechanical way that, basically marries up to support the players more. The long and short of it is we're trying to give the players more resources for them to play with, not necessarily bottleneck them in the context of like, I don't know what's going to happen next. By letting them know what the role is, because if they succeed really well, like let's just say, for example, somebody's going to punch really, really well, and it's going to hit, you as a person who's supporting him are not going to get in the way because you might actually get in the way of the punch. But if he's going to punch, the other person is dodging, and they're probably going to dodge. You're probably going to go there and push them and shove them in, or manage to go in for your own punch, because after they dodge that one, they're going to get hit with yours. That creates a level of decision making, even though it's on the fly and in microseconds of thinking. On the table, when somebody decides to help in these manners, it makes sense. The only limitations is every player needs to only be able to help once, because otherwise it's just ridiculous. And then secondly, if it makes sense for you to be able to help. There was countless times when my players sat down and it didn't just make sense for them to be there. Like, for example, you're all the way across the battlefield. You can't just magically jump in and do something. But like, let's just say if they're a ranger, they would shoot one of their bowls towards them, causing them to dodge, which puts them in the position of them getting hit kind of attitude. So long as range is justified or the actions are justified ultimately, then it's fine. But if it isn't, or the player isn't creative enough, unfortunately, to come up with their own thing, usually I would help them. And if I couldn't help them, I'd literally just say to them, sorry, that just doesn't work, and then we move on. So yeah, that's basically how players go after the role. Oh, I asked them, do you want to lock that in? Because I tried with, are you happy with that, for a while, and 90% of the time is, no, I'm not happy with my role, but I can't do anything about it, so I'm locking it in. Instead of keep hearing that statement, I decided to change it to, do you want to lock that in? And as soon as they lock it in, that is it. If they decided to lock it in a very abrupt way, I have some players who are just like, oh yeah, I'll lock it in. And I'm like, okay, just think about it. The one that just rolled a 15 earlier failed, and you just rolled a 13. Are you sure you want to lock it in? Just to give them that little bit of a prompt, because it does become a thing of like figuring out what the challenge rating of the creature is. Because, not gonna lie, when I was a player and I was doing stuff, I was actually figuring it out, and it was kind of fun. Like sitting there in the background, like it was like, oh, the 16 didn't hit, but the 18 did, so it's probably between 17 or 18. And then as soon as the 17 hit, I'm like, sweet, it's a 17, and locked it in. And I started, just going down that path, which means that every time somebody rolled, oh, like, wait a second, you only have a +1. Let's bump that up, add a hope to increase your experience, to bump it up to a 3 or whatever, which increases your likelihood of potentially hitting that number that we want. And stuff like that. So, yeah, possible downside is the players knowing what the challenge is, which I've already discussed. And players hoarding resources. Excuse me. So, if you're afraid that players are going to hoard resources because they're just going to keep succeeding because they're rolling really well, then good. It's a reward for players to be rolling really well. I have some players on my table. It is insane, but their luck is ridiculous. They'll crit like 5 times in a session, and it's almost consistent, while the rest of the table fails miserably. So the game somehow balances itself out. Okay, yes, some players are just going to keep succeeding, and that's okay. But before, when we were rolling d20s with D&D and stuff, I would think that, oh, maybe the dice is rigged. But now I'm starting to realize that it's not the dice; it's the players. They're just insanely lucky. But even if they do succeed, just reward them accordingly and then move on. The chances of you to be able to act and perform things or whatever, you can always adjust it. And as a GM, you have the ultimate power. And so if you really wanted to increase the challenge and make it harder or whatever, do so. But 99% of the time, players are not going to hoard the resources because they're going to be more incentivized to spend it because they want to succeed the task. The number of times that I had players around the table that are so intent of like wanting to succeed that one thing, the die roll ended up getting help from like every single person around the table, and it still didn't hit the numbers that they wanted, and yet they weren't disappointed. Obviously, yeah, they were disappointed in the context like they failed, but like it wasn't a, oh well, we just rolled once and that is it, I guess, too bad, and that kind of sucks. It's more like, we all tried our hardest, all right, let's see what the consequence is. And it creates a very cool way of doing it. Alternatively, I was also being a little bit cheeky sometimes, where they clearly succeeded. The creature's challenge is only a 15 and they roll a 16, and I'd look at them and I say, do you want to lock that in? And they look at me thinking that this is me saying that they failed. And then they start spending hope, and they went around the table 3 times, and then by the time they finished was like 18 or 19 at the time. I'm like, yep, you succeed, you hit. And I just never tell them. And then one person goes and rolls a 16 and is like, sorry, I can't do any more. And then they lock it in. And I'm like, yeah, you hit. And they look at each other like, wait, what? And then kind of moves on from there. So it is a little bit of a bluff thing as well, which if you want to play it as that, but it is just a fun resource to let the players have their own thing. All right, moving on. Okay, so this is a grittier scar mechanic. This is not because I decided to use it, it's just I misinterpreted the rules. And I did it for the longest time until recently, and I learned that it wasn't the case. Long story short, when somebody drops down to 0 hit points, they can choose to roll a scar. They would roll the scar, and if they roll their level or lower, then they would gain a scar. Otherwise, they will be fine. I was under the assumption that every action that needed to be taken outside of not helping your friend was going to give them a scar. Well, they get to roll for a scar. That was pretty brutal. It definitely put the tension on the players, and I've had a lot of fun just pushing players beyond their limit, because I had one player where they just didn't have the resources to heal her, and she lost like 4 hope, and that was before the update, so she was down on her last hope, and it was pretty intense. And they were only like level 2, so you can imagine the like, oh my god, I can't play my character anymore, which ended up causing me to create the Dark Pact a little bit later. But so it was a blessing in disguise, I guess. But long story short, it's a fun thing to do if you really want to push the tension on them. Alternatively, I decided to make this rule new, where every time an enemy attacks an unconscious creature, they just get to roll a scar again, which is also another level of danger, because it's like not HP damage, but like, hey, you're going to permanently lose this character kind of level, which is also a very, very big problem. Because if there's like a horde of enemies and they're like stabbity, stabbity, stab, chances are you're going to probably get a few extra scars. So I feel like that's probably going to be a rule that I'm going to carry forward with. While the grittier scar mechanic, I might just reserve it to like special bosses, maybe a necromancer or something where just by being around the vicinity, or maybe the layer causes that effect to trigger, and then that becomes fun. Next thing is Dark Pact. So I ended up creating like this Dark Patron of like Void of sorts, and I gave them this scar mechanic, which when you roll with fear, you track scars, which is similar to hope, but you know, you get your scar tokens, and you can't get more scars than the scars that you have. So similar to how much you can't get more hope than the hope that you have. Same thing with scars. And then the Dark Patron could give you one of the examples of abilities that I've kind of portrayed in these example there. And they are like kind of opposite mechanic to the hope mechanic. So long story short, Shrouded in Abyss, you spend 2 resources to give yourself advantage on a fear or die roll, which normally you have to reroll the hope, but this one you reroll the fear. Or you can spend 1 scar resource to help an ally have advantage on their fear, which I feel like is a fun thing of like, in a very dark and twisted way, you support your allies. And lack of a better term, it's kind of is a little bit more powerful than hope, because you can actually bump, because the biggest problem when you roll the dice and you only have advantage, if your fear dice is a 1, chances of you rolling high is slim to none, and so the people kind of just give up at that time, because realistically you can't get like to high threshold, especially when you're fighting like a boss of like 17 or 18 or 19 challenge. In this context, I get to reroll that fear. Not only is it definitely going to increase that number, but it's really making the mechanic a lot more powerful. And it's a super OP thing, and I don't give this to anyone, because I only give this to the players that first accept the Dark Pact, which then makes the whole Warlock thing a lot more intimate, so to speak, because you're looking at things from the perspective of like, actually I made this during the session, instead of before the story starts I have a Dark Patron and now I have to follow his bidding, and then the GM comes up with stuff. This one is like, hey, this is a prominent entity in the world, you just decided to make a deal with it, now it wants this one particular thing because it's quote unquote achieving their agenda, and you're now forced to make choices, because if you refuse to honor that deal, immediately that ability disappears and the scars are just scars again. While if you have the pact, the scars are almost like a secondary hope mechanic. So it's a cool thing to do. At least that's how I'm experiencing it. And next is the Eyes of the Abyss. So you spend the scar resource to see through illusions or invisibility and finding ley lines of the souls of the creature that lasts for the scene. I did this specifically for my world because I do a lot of things with souls and stuff. I love soul concepts and everything. And the whole thing about seeing illusions and invisibility, I thought it would be cool, because there's all the times like, hey, I want to see detect magic, and that kind of sees some magics or whatever, but then specifically illusions and invisibility is it adds another layer to the story, which I think is fun. Next is Guidance from the Abyss. You use 1 scar resource to shift the fear dice by 1 value. So if you rolled a 2 and a 3, you can shift it to a 3 and a 3, counts as a crit, and so on and so forth. Don't know why Stella's there, but I might have done that for whatever reason. I need to probably delete that. Anyway, Sacrifice. Convert 2 to 1 hope to scar ratio resources, or vice versa, meaning that if I had 2 scars, I can get a hope from it, or 2 hoped, I can get a scar. And it's the whole concept of, hey, I really want to help my friend reroll their fear. I'm going to spend 2 hope, which is, not going to lie, it's pretty expensive, but it's going to be worth it, because if you're really desperate to roll that roll. Anyway, that's the Dark Pacts. Next is going to be Rolling with Advantage. So players roll with advantage. even though like the player can get an advantage, if another player is helping you, I always encourage my other players to roll the advantage. It actually legitimately gives the feeling of the player helping, because you're literally rolling the dice and you're giving that additional number, if you are giving that additional number or the crit, to that other person. So, and then it immediately gives the narration of, oh, that thing that you just did actually helped, or that thing that you did actually didn't, because their roll couldn't succeed and therefore XYZ happened. So it's a fun thing to do, but also the GM rolls for the disadvantage. So the disadvantage, I'm not a big fan of it with the new update that they did, and so when you roll the hope dice again and get the lower roll, it's kind of meh, because you can always crit as well. And it's kind of weird how you can crit with a disadvantaged roll. It didn't make sense to me, and so I changed it to reroll the fear. And so rerolling the fear made it, as a GM, so interesting to decide what I wanted to give them. So I've rolled a dice that was pretty high at the time, but they rolled like a 2 on the fear and a 7 on their hope. And I was looking at the 9 that I rolled, and I'm like, I rolled a 9 on the fear, which is going to cause them to succeed, but I'm going to get a fear token. Even though I'm going to go next regardless, because they're going to fail, or I get to get a fear token. I decided to let them take the hit so I can get a fear token, so I can use the fear to perform other BS the creatures get to do. And so that is the beauty of what it is that, you know, when you roll with disadvantage for GMs with fear. Great rules. Advantage stacks and disadvantage stacks, and they don't cancel each other out, meaning that you get to roll your hope and I get to roll my fear, and whatever comes out of it at the end comes out of it. Because you can always just choose the highest hope, and I would choose whatever fear that I want. But then as the GM, I would roll the disadvantage first and then the advantage that go. So then you can still have a chance of credit. Because, not gonna lie, the game is designed to be on the player's side. You know, the GM has their fear tokens and everything and stuff like that, but it is a heroic game. The players need to feel awesome, and that's how I would do it anyway. Oh, and regarding these Dark Patron and Scar rule and stuff, if you have advantage and disadvantage, I think the GM will always roll first. I think the GM will always reveal the information first, and then the player, and then the player can do what they like. But that's only if you want to use the grid rules, I guess. Going on, overstress. I have witnessed people having no fear of being stressed out, which personally I feel like it's kind of a negative thing, because it is a resource, and when you run out of a resource, it's supposed to like hurt. For example, if you run out of armor, you start taking direct damage, and that stuff is just going to be a lot more painful to deal with than having armor and protecting yourself. Alternatively, stress, when you run out, you become vulnerable, which means only when I attack you, you do stuff. I decided to make it that you have disadvantage on their attack rolls instead of being vulnerable. Or just spectacularly rolls, because you're so stressed out, you're overthinking, or you're causing yourself to double, triple, quadruple think yourself, and so on and so forth. And so that's just going to cause you a higher chance of making mistakes. And as soon as that happens, it means that I get to do a lot more control over the fear roll and causing things to happen to my advantage. And that's where it kind of ties in well with the stacking advantage and disadvantage thing as well. Next is armor slots. So this is mechanics that I felt like would be cool to have as part of armor slots with armors and stuff. So for example, spending an armor slot to shoot out a bolt at an enemy, dealing armor points and damage. So your armor is like these spikes or whatever that you can literally shoot these magical things towards them. Obviously the shot will have to be some sort of mechanic that has to be applied to it. Maybe a finesse roll or a strength roll or whatever roll that applies to that particular armor. But it would be cool to have it so that, because I feel like the way they did armor is so much better in the new update, because it gives you a thing to play with instead of it just being the static stuff that just blocks damage. So using armor slots to inject a creature wearing it with energy back. So for example, giving it stress back for 2 slots used, or an HP back for 3 slots used. And then you have armor slots be spent to generate a propulsion to push the user up to far range without spending an action, which I believe the card effect is effectively a stress, if I recall correctly. But it's basically the same concept because, stress and armor is, depending on how you're looking at it, you're still spending a level up just to get 1 armor slot. So it's not a nothing endeavor. And next is deal additional damage using your armor points to the target when you spend an armor slot. So it's similar to the other one where you shoot it out. Well, this one is when you deal an attack damage. This thing either increases your strength or radiates with necrotic energy or whatever you want, electrical energy and the like. You gain resistance to a damage type by spending an armor slots, possibly 2 or 3. 2 if it is a specific damage type, like for example fire or lightning, etc. Or 3 if it's going to be the entire category, like physical or magical. Which I think could be cool because I think one of the armors in the official rules, book that they've released, had you spend 3 armor points to become resistant to damage, to the next instance of damage, which, that could work. Next is increase evasion by spending armor slots. I reckon similar to the propulsion one where it moved you far away, you could probably spend an armor slot to give yourself a +2 or potentially a +3 to dodge an attack roll, because then you're not having to actually perform it. But I have had this problem where I had players go, oh no, well actually I'm gonna add this and this and this to my armor after I've made the roll. It's usually you need to announce what the roll, like what your armor is, before the roll is finished. As soon as the roll is said, hey, I've rolled a 15, does it hit? It's too late. You can't add any more things. That's usually my rule. Otherwise, people kind of just retroactively add stuff just so they can justify something. Next, blood magic. I played around with this concept. I haven't had enough players playtesting this yet, but I just thought it would be cool, so I've added it to the thing. You spend HP to get blood points equal to your casting modifier, which usually is going to be a 2 or 3 if you're low levels, and up to 5, maybe even 6 at high levels, depending on how you build your character, which I think normally you get to go to +5, and then item stuff will get you up to a 6. But you can spend blood points to power your spells by increasing the damage dice, or increase the range, or target an additional target, etc. So it's almost like sorcery points from D&D, where it gives you a lot of like subtle spells and stuff like that, etc. That kind of concept or that kind of feel, but it's the thing that I want to do with this is tack this on to characters without having the built-in like, oh, we have to adhere to some sort of rules. It's or like a class or a subclass or whatever. It's like, oh, you want blood magic? Here you go. This is a blood magic thing, and now you can do blood magic stuff. Maybe attach it to an item or attach it to some sort of thing, but making this part of a class is kind of maybe because it does specifically say spells. I feel like it would be so cool to give blood magic to a warrior and then just have him increase his damage dice. So he does a d10, it goes to a d12. And obviously then there's a trick, because if you're going to go from a d12 to a d20, that becomes a problem as well. But anyway, maybe we make it for every trait. You, like, let's just say you got a +3, your casting trait. So therefore now it's going to be 3 of your dice can be converted to a d20. And a crit on that is just going to be monstrous. Yeah, and that's like blood magic. I started thinking about it yesterday after I started working on this. I want to do something for vampires and werewolves as well, where you give like basically the Vampire the Masquerade mechanics, where they get like 5 hunger. I'm not actually familiar with the werewolf rules. I need to look into those. But basically the 5 hunger, and they would gain those 5 hungers, and every time certain conditions are met, they would then gain hunger, and they need to feed to release that hunger, or like satiate the hunger, and then have it so that certain abilities and attacks are tacked onto this hunger. Like one of the ideas that I had was, if they can attack with their fangs, let's just make them a d6 for argument's sake, and they did 2 HP of damage, then they would relieve their hunger of 2 HP by sucking on that, and then they can spend hunger to heal HP. And so if they have like 5 hunger that is not used, and they can spend like 1 hunger to gain back an HP, that seems a bit powerful, but vampires are powerful. But it's still, it's in the works, it's in my mind. I'll see what I can do with it, but I just thought it'd be a cool thing to have vampires and werewolves be a part of it, and then potentially tack on some other monstrosity, but we haven't really thought about that yet. Anyway, move on. Homebrew items. So these are just a handful of items that I decided, well, 4. Should probably put 5 items on the list, where, long story short, I've actually created almost 100 of them, but they're just D&D-esque items that I love the picture and the image of it, and using them I kind of was inspired to create a new thing that fits the theme of it. So one of the ones, which is one of my favorites, is Feather of Creation, which is like a little quill that you get to write with, and you draw anything and turn it into life. You spend hope on a tiny item, 2 hope on a small item, 3 on a medium, 4 on a large, 5 on a huge. And if it's a creature, it is made to deal with a d8 of damage plus the hope spent on it. So for example, if I spend 4 hope to create a creature, it has 4d8. I guess the way I've worded it was a bit weird. I think it's hope d8 of damage. But anyway, each will have a stress value of hope spent on it. Okay, so do you know how creatures of like rangers and stuff, when they have their little creature with them, creature companion, they have a stress value, and no matter how much damage they take, they always just take 1 HP of damage. And so the same thing with this. If you decided to summon a creature that is a 4 hope, they will have effectively 4 HP before it just completely disappears and it's gone. And if you use this when the action tracker is out, for every hope you spend, you place an action token on the board. So if you decided to build a huge creature with 5 points, then you're giving the GM 5 action tokens to do with, which, because it just denotes the time that it took to build this thing. Because you're not going to be drawing like at super lightning speed. The idea is just to balance the game out, because whatever you're going to be summoning is going to be literally an additional ally that's going to be a problem for the GM to have to deal with now. Yeah, the next item is a 1,000 cut blade. So it's a d6, d10 plus 6 greatsword. You can spend distress to deal different instances of damage. I should have said deal. Instances of damage for each proficiency dice used. For example, if you rolled 3, if you have 3 proficiency, you will roll 3d10 plus 6. But if you spend 1 stress, you will roll 1d10 plus 2 with 1 instance of damage, and then another instance of 2d10 plus 4. Or you can spend 2 stress and make it 1d10 plus 2, 3 instances of damage of 1 in that 1 slash. I know it's very like specific and thing, but this is like, because of the damage threshold and everything, if you landed the hit, that's almost guaranteeing 3 HP of damage. Yes, you're spending stress on yourself, but you're not going to have an unlimited number of stress. You can only do this so many times. And I get it, used up against the boss, it can be really, really powerful. But realistically speaking, it's yeah, it is what it is. It's a fun thing to do, because, you know, the argument would be like, oh, but what if it's a late game and I have like 8 stress and I have 6 proficiency? I'm like, well, spend 5 proficiency stress, and deal 6 instances of damage, and that's 6 HP of damage, which is very, very strong. So it is balanced with way that the character is, but yeah, I haven't tested it. I thought it was cool. Feel free to test it out and then tell me how you feel about it. Spider Flask. You can command it using one hope to travel up to far range and inject its content. The content of its content inside the creature. God, what am I writing? Anyway, I've written this yesterday. I was obviously not 100% there. But long story short, whatever the contents inside the flask gets injected onto the creature. If it's a healing potion, it heals the creature. If it's a poisonous thing or whatever, they want to attack somebody, then you roll with the instinct and attack the creature and then inject them with it. It's a super cool item, very flexible, and it creates a very fun utility for the party, especially when like allies are far away and stuff. Winged Shield. It's a D8 shield, 6 armor and -2 to evasion because it's like a tower shield of sorts. And you can convert it into a longbow that is like spanks out, and then you can shoot it as a longbow. And you can freely change it from a longbow to a shield again. And it is a two-handed weapon, and you can spend a hope to slow your fall and not take any fall damage if you're falling. Which, it's a fun thing to do. Bonus homebrews. These are things that I haven't had the chance to truly test out yet, but I'm going to be adding it into my games in the coming future. Player intrusion. It costs 3 hope. This is a concept from Numenera, and giving the players the ability to control the scene or moment, thus giving them the ability to create opportunities for themselves, such as create a situation or environmental advantage, like breaking a weapon of the enemy or causing an enemy that you're chasing to trip, or breaking down a wall, creating a blockage, or escape from players. Long story short, player intrusions are a fun way to not just like, hey, I succeed at this, because that's not what it's intended to be. It's more like, hey, I am going to clip the wing of that dragon and make it fall down. Cool. This sounds like a player intrusion. Go ahead and do it. Perform the attack roll. And yeah, okay, there's a chance that you might miss the attack roll or anything, but then the player intrusion is only paid after the success of the attack. So yeah, it's a fun thing to do, to give the players a lot more freedom and a lot more choice in the matter of how the world interacts with them. I love it when players go out of their way to actually do environmental effects, where you would smack the ground and crackle it to break it apart, causing it to be difficult terrain for them to run through, etc. So on and so forth. Next is Flashback, which is from the Blades in the Dark system, where you can go back in time and say you got something or a piece of information and discuss with the GM, then perform the appropriate rolls. This gives them the ability to plan without spending hours in real time doing it, or just a nice perk to say you did X, Y, or Z. It's a cool way to, in the middle of the session, you'll be like, actually, I had this recently where she was chasing after this creature, was running, and they didn't have any weapons on them, and the creature threw a dagger at them. Halfway through the chase, they were like, actually, I don't have a weapon on myself. I don't want to hit them with my fist. I'm going to use a flashback to go back to when they threw it for me to pick it up. And I'm like, sweet, give me a finesse roll to kind of jump out of the way and then pick it up as you run, to keep running with it. And they succeeded the finesse roll. When they went back to the present time, they had the dagger on them, and they took it and they stabbed it in the arm, and so on and so forth. And they started fighting with the dagger. So that's like a simple example of how flashback can be used, or it can be used to be like, actually, I knew that we were going to be here going up this guy's house or whatever, so I've prepared this portable ladder. And in this context, I'd be like, cool, you give me 3 gold coins because that's what you needed to spend it for that ladder, so on and so forth, or a grappling hook and a rope, whatever the scenario applies. So it's either costs money or role, or even an entire roleplay scenario where they could try to convince a god that, hey, remember yesterday I came in and I bribed you to get us in, you're just going to let us in, and then we get to roleplay the part where they were trying to negotiate with them on how they're going to bribe them and how much for, etc., etc., and then maybe a presence roll to get them to accept. And yeah, these two mechanics help encourage creative thinking, and both mechanics will be used once per player, just like the tag team rules, which I think should be enough. Should be. I haven't decided yet because I haven't had a chance to test it out yet enough, but I feel like this is a cool thing. Last but not least, this thing is going to be the largest out of the lot. And this is debt moves. You do someone a favor. So when you do someone a favor, they owe you a debt. So anytime you want to help somebody, this is from the Urban Shadows, by the way. Urban Shadows is a beautiful game that I don't know if they've released the second edition yet or not, but basically it's political intrigue in urban settings, and people can play vampires, werewolves, and so on and so forth, and you have territories, and you're controlling different, NPCs and stuff like that with your debts, and it's a really, really fun game. And long story short, you gain a debt from somebody if you do them a favor, and like, let's just say you help the king kill the dragon. The king is now indebted to you because he saved his people, and he might give you even a major debt, not just a normal debt. And we'll talk about those in a little bit, but the idea is you're gaining this resource and then you can call upon it, similar to having shops. So if I'm in a shop and I look at the players, and the players are like struggling to come up with the money to do this, I'm like, hey, I'll tell you what, I have this job that I could get done that it would be nice for you guys to help me out with, and I give you this item. Or you take this and then you owe me a debt. Obviously, if they're just traveling from one town to another, you can't do that. But it's like an established town, the shopkeeper knows that, and so on and so forth. They're like, hey, I'll give you a debt, and I'll call on that debt later when I need it. And they're like, cool. They'll take a debt from you, or they take a major debt, depending on how powerful the item is. You decide as a GM, and then move on. It's a fun thing to do. Personally, I think that's pretty cool. Favor, and you can interrupt somebody's business. Interfere with somebody's business. You owe them a debt. So I killed somebody's partner. They're gonna remember me. So next time, if they are a person that didn't just want vengeance, they'll be like, hey, you killed my partner. You're gonna do this for me because you killed my partner. I'll be talking about refuse to honor a debt. When you refuse to honor a debt, you roll with the challenge of the NPC. On a success with hope, you weasel out the obligation for now, but you still owe the debt. On a success with fear, you weasel out the obligation and still owe the debt, but the next time you attempt to refuse to honor your debt, you roll with disadvantage. On a failure with fear, you owe an additional debt and you don't take the fear token. On a failure, you can't avoid the noose. Either you honor the debt in full, or the debt escalates to the next tier. So, as you can see that if you failed with fear, it escalates to the next tier and you get an additional debt, which is very brutal. But, it is what it is. It's one of those things that if you're going to refuse to honor your debt, to do the things that you would. But like as I described earlier, like let's just say you're dealing with a vampire lord, tier 2, you would need to roll like a 16 or higher on that roll for you to succeed. And so on and so forth. So the whole concept of these debts is to create another layer to interact with the world. Instead of like focusing on, hey, I can do this and this and that because this person likes me. It's, hey, I've actually helped this person. This person actually owes me a debt. And then you would go to them to get that thing answered. So example of debts is they can answer you a question honestly. And this is the thing that is non-negotiable. Like for the GM side, I get GMs that are like, oh, but this creature needs to like hold this information or whatever, etc. And like the mechanic is designed so that it is to support the players. And if a player decided to spend an entire debt to get one honest answer, then you should give them the most honest answer you can from that player without holding anything back and giving them as much information as possible. You're trying to to create an opportunity for your players to embody this instead of standing in their way, creating various different effects. Because I get certain NPCs are like, oh, these guys are gothy and they have to do XYZ. It's like, then don't put them in a way that they become indebted to the players. And personally, I love putting those kind of players indebted to the players, because then if a player did decide to use this, now this is an opportunity for me to go, okay, lore dump. And so, yeah. And next is arrange a meeting with an NPC they know, somebody important, and so on and so forth. Or grant you a worthy boon or useful gift within their capabilities. Erase a debt they hold on somebody else. Give you a debt they hold on someone else. Or perform a task they would be in their comfort zone, meaning that something that I'm capable of doing. Giving you a debt they hold on someone else is really powerful, because then you could be like, actually, I know you did this and this and this to such person. He told me about this. You're gonna owe me now because you think, but it's gonna clear his debt. And be like, okay, fine. What do I need to do? So it's a cool way to do it, because then it's like, hey, I might get the baker to be indebted to me, but then the baker would then give me the blacksmith's debt. Then I could get the blacksmith to give me a cool item. Does that make sense? Next is a major debt. You grant you a worthy boon of a useful gift despite the hardship or embarrassment, and perform a task that would be out of their comfort zone, or they can convert it to 2 debts. Okay. And last is the life debt. Grant you a worthy boon or useful gift that would cost them dearly, or perform a task that would be put their life on the line, or convert it to 2 major debts. The reason between the difference between life, major, and normal debt is a standard debt would sit in the line where, okay, let's just say I'm a baker and you wanted to get 3 bags of gold to travel. I would literally say, I can't. It's not literally in my capability to do so. Even a major debt would be, even inside my comfort zone, it's like, I don't have the functional ability to do so. But if I had a life debt to you as a baker, I would sell my bakery, get the money from it, and then pay you the 3 bags of gold to ensure that you go on your journey, because I owe you a life debt. While if I was a king, a normal debt would be like, okay, here's the 3 bags of gold. So different people and different capabilities causes different things to happen. But it just means that you get to decide on what you want to do with these things. It's a fun thing to do. It is not a difficult thing to apply to your fantasy games. And it does create another layer. And I get there's a lot more like tracking from a GM point of view. But especially if you want to build a political game, this is magic. But if it's not a political game and you just want to have it as like an extra layer, it's so much fun to play with. These are my things. This video went way longer than I intended for it to be. But I hope you enjoyed it, and leave your comments below to tell me what you thought, and give it a thumbs up and click that subscribe button, and hopefully we'll catch you guys in the next week for a new video. Cheers.